In this next section, I'll talk a little bit about what makes the acceptance and commitment therapy or ACT approach to trauma different. So, first of all, as a reminder, some consistent findings from the PTSD literature. As we discussed, trauma exposure is extremely common, but PTSD is much less common. We know that many people recover naturally after a traumatic experience, but an important minority do go on to develop chronic and persistent symptoms. The good news? Treatment works, especially if it's provided early. And one of the interesting things is that most of the effective treatments for PTSD have an exposure component. And exposure is that part of therapy where the person is asked to go into and describe or re-experience the trauma event in a safe way, but to do so over and over in order to reduce some of the negative experiences that are associated with the memory. That exposure can be in vivo exposure, so in the real world. It can be imaginal, so in the person's memory or imagination. And so current effective treatments for PTSD, as I mentioned, they almost all have some aspect of exposure. And so that could be prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy. Treatments like anxiety management training or stress inoculation training, combinations like exposure and anxiety management training, and even treatments like EMDR, which probably like cognitive processing therapy is a combination treatment that brings together several different components. So if there are these existing treatments, why wouldn't we just use existing treatments for PTSD? Well, first of all, even though they are quite effective, they're not universally effective. Not everyone responds to those existing treatments. And as I mentioned, many of those treatments have an exposure component, and not all clients are willing to do exposure. And in fact, not all therapists want to do exposure. In addition, exposure, at least originally, is built on a fear-based conceptualization of PTSD. So the idea that if you go through and remember the details of a traumatic event over and over and over, that the level of anxiety over time will habituate and reduce. So it's based on a fear or anxiety-based conceptualization of PTSD. And what we know is that there are a broad range of emotional experiences that people have after a traumatic event. It's not just fear and anxiety. And there's also a little bit of data to show that clients whose primary emotional reaction is anger or guilt don't benefit as much from existing treatments. So what does ACT have to offer the field of trauma? First of all, it allows us to pay attention to that whole continuum of emotional experience. Shame, guilt, fear, anxiety, anger, sadness, grief. There's also an added focus on quality of life, not just symptom reduction. There's also a little bit of evidence that doing ACT and working on values especially can improve response to exposure therapy. And it allows us to address additional clinical problems at the same time using a consistent theoretical framework. So, for example, if somebody has depression at the same time as PTSD or an alcohol use problem at the same time as PTSD, we don't have to find a separate treatment to do for the depression or the substance use problem, because in fact, ACT has also been shown to be effective for those problems. So we can use one model to address those problems at the same time. It's important for treatment decisions to be made based on data. So first of all, preliminary observational studies do suggest that ACT may be a promising intervention for the treatment of PTSD. For example, there are a handful of case studies examining ACT for the treatment of PTSD by itself or for PTSD and comorbid disorders that show demonstrated significant improvement in PTSD symptoms. There's also a pilot study of ACT for co-occurring PTSD and alcohol use disorder, and they found strong effect sizes for the reduction of PTSD scores and alcohol-related outcomes. There have also been 2 other open trials that found positive outcomes for reductions in PTSD symptoms, one with 30 female survivors of sexual assault, and the other with 80 outpatient clients with a variety of traumatic experiences. And finally, correlational studies have found that measures of increased acceptance, psychological flexibility, and decreased thought suppression have been associated with improvements in PTSD symptoms, as well as reduced anxiety and depression. So, to summarize some key points, there are several existing treatments for PTSD that are effective. However, they are not universally effective or accepted. And ACT addresses the limitations of some of these treatments while still incorporating effective components such as exposure. ACT can be applied to the full range of emotional experience post trauma. And even better, it addresses quality of life above just symptom reduction. And preliminary studies show that ACT is effective for post traumatic problems such as PTSD and substance use problems.